Welcome. Tonight, we rest beside the river, where the water teaches us its oldest lesson: how to let go. Here, the current knows nothing of holding on. It does not clutch at the stones it passes, does not try to keep the leaves that fall upon its surface. It simply flows, carrying everything forward, releasing everything in turn. And in this endless letting go, it finds its way. These are stories of release, of surrender, of the gentle art of opening your hands and allowing what must leave to leave. They are not stories of loss, but of freedom, not stories of emptiness, but of making room. Here, beside these quiet waters, you will meet people who have learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that holding on too tightly is its own kind of suffering, and that letting go is not giving up, but waking up. So settle yourself now. Let your body rest where it is. Let your breath find its own rhythm, like water finding its own course. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. Nothing you need to fix or solve or carry. The river will carry it all for you, and you can simply rest. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and let the first story begin. The old teacher arrived at the river just as the first light was touching the eastern sky. He had walked through the darkness, his feet knowing the path without needing to see it, and now he stood at the water's edge and watched the world slowly brighten around him. The river was wide here, moving steadily but not urgently, and its surface caught the growing light and held it like polished glass. He had come here every morning for 40 years, ever since he had first taken his vows and begun teaching at the small temple in the valley. Every morning, the same walk, the same river, the same ritual of arriving before dawn and watching the day begin. And every morning, the river was different, higher or lower, faster or slower, carrying different debris, reflecting different colors of sky. This constancy in change had taught him more than any sutra, more than any master's words. The river was always the river, and yet it was never the same river. The water that flowed past him now would be gone in moments, replaced by new water, and that water too would pass, and on, endlessly flowing, endlessly new. He set down the small bundle he had been carrying and knelt at the water's edge. The stones beneath his knees were smooth and cool, worn round by countless seasons of water and weather. He placed his palms flat on the largest stone and felt its solidity, its patient presence. This stone had been here long before him and would remain long after. It asked nothing of him, it simply was. He closed his eyes and listened. The sound of the river was complex, layered: the rush of the main current in the center, the gentle lapping at the edges, the occasional splash where the water hit a protruding rock. Beneath it all, a deeper sound, almost a hum, the voice of the river itself, constant and eternal. He breathed in the smell of the water, clean and mineral, mixed with the scent of wet earth and early morning dew. The air was cool against his face, and he could feel the faint mist rising from the river's surface, tiny droplets settling on his skin like the softest rain. He opened his eyes and looked down into the water. It was clear enough here at the edge that he could see the bottom, see the pebbles and sand, see the way the current moved them slightly, shifting and rearranging them in patterns that would never repeat. He watched a small leaf float past, spinning slowly, and he followed it with his eyes until it disappeared around the bend downstream. The teacher reached into his bundle and pulled out a small cloth bag. Inside were slips of paper, perhaps 20 of them, each one bearing a name written in careful brush strokes. These were his students, past and present, the ones he had taught and guided and worried over, Some of them had stayed at the temple and become teachers themselves. Some had left to return to their families or to wander as pilgrims. Some had disappointed him, some had surprised him. All of them lived in his heart, whether he wished them to or not. The teacher had carried these names with him for many years, adding new ones as students arrived, keeping the old ones even after students left. He had told himself it was a way of remembering, of honoring his connection to them, of maintaining his responsibility as their teacher. But lately, he had begun to understand that it was also a burden, this carrying, this holding on. He was old now. His back hurt in the mornings, and his hands trembled when he wrote. He had trained successors, capable teachers who would carry the work forward when he was gone. And yet he still carried these names, still held on to these connections, as if releasing them would mean he had failed somehow, as if letting go would be a betrayal. But the river had been teaching him otherwise. Every morning for 40 years, he had watched it let go, letting go of leaves, letting go of branches, letting go of the rain that fell into it, letting go of its own water as it flowed ever onward toward the sea. The river did not diminish by releasing. It remained full, remained itself, precisely because it did not hold on. He took the first slip of paper from the bag and read the name. A young monk who had studied with him for 5 years and then left suddenly one night, leaving only a brief note of apology. The teacher had felt betrayed, had carried the hurt for years, wondering what he had done wrong, what he could have done differently. He looked at the name now, and he felt the old familiar ache, but softer now, more distant. He touched the paper to his forehead, a gesture of blessing, and then he leaned forward and placed it on the water's surface. The current caught it immediately, and the paper floated away, spinning slightly, the ink beginning to blur and run. He watched it go, watched it become smaller and smaller, until he could no longer distinguish it from the river itself. And as it disappeared, he felt something release in his chest, some small knot he had been carrying unknowingly. He reached for the second slip of paper, a student who had died young, taken by illness before completing his training. The teacher had grieved deeply, had questioned the teachings, had wondered why such a bright spirit had been taken so soon. He had carried this grief like a stone, heavy and cold. He held the paper now and felt tears rise in his eyes, but they were different tears than before, gentler somehow. He touched the paper to his lips and whispered, "Go in peace." And then he placed it on the water and watched it drift away. One by one, he took the slips of paper and released them to the river. Each name brought its own memory, its own weight, its own tangle of emotion, pride, disappointment, love, regret, hope, sorrow, and each one he blessed and released, watching as the river carried it away, dissolving the ink, softening the paper, eventually absorbing it completely into the endless flow. The sun was fully risen by the time the teacher reached the last slip of paper. His hands were empty now except for this final name, and he held it for a long time, reading it over and over. It was his own name, written in his own hand. This was the hardest release of all, he realized. Not the students, not the disappointments or the griefs, but himself. His idea of himself as the teacher, as the one who needed to guide and protect and carry everyone. His attachment to being needed, to being important, to leaving a legacy. The river flowed on, indifferent to his struggle, and in its indifference, he found a strange comfort. The river did not need him to acknowledge it. The sun did not need him to watch it rise. The world would continue its turning whether he held on or let go, and in that continuation, in that great ongoing cycle of which he was just a small and temporary part, there was a kind of peace. He looked down at his name on the paper and felt a smile come to his lips. How absurd, really, to think that this small collection of syllables defined him, that this role of teacher was who he truly was. He was so much more than that, and also so much less. He was a temporary arrangement of elements, a brief flowering of consciousness, a wave on the surface of a vast ocean. And soon enough, like the wave, he would return to the ocean, and the ocean would remain unchanged and complete. He touched the paper with his name to his heart, and then he placed it on the water. It floated there for a moment, as if uncertain, and then the current took it, and it began to move downstream, turning and drifting, following all the other names into the great releasing. He watched it go, watched himself go, and he felt a lightness he had not felt in years, a freedom that came not from achievement or enlightenment, but simply from opening his hands and allowing the river to be the river, to do what rivers do. He sat there for a long time after all the papers were gone, watching the water flow, watching the light change as the sun climbed higher. He noticed how the river caught the light differently now, how the colors shifted from silver to gold to the deep green blue of full morning. He noticed the birds beginning to call from the trees along the bank, their voices bright and unconcerned. He noticed his own breathing, steady and calm, and the way his body felt lighter, as if some weight he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted. After a while, the teacher stood slowly, feeling the stiffness in his knees, and he brushed the dust from his robes. He looked once more at the river, at the place where he had released the names, but there was no trace of them now. The water flowed clean and clear, carrying no evidence of what had passed, holding no memory of what it had received. This too was a teaching, he thought. The river did not hold on to what it carried. It received everything and released everything with equal grace, with equal indifference. It did not judge what came to it, leaves or branches, prayers or tears, names or regrets. It simply carried them all downstream and let them go. He bowed deeply to the river, a gesture of gratitude and respect, and then he turned and began to walk back toward the temple. But he walked differently now, more lightly, as if his feet barely touched the ground. The path was the same path he had walked for 40 years, but it felt new somehow, as if he were seeing it for the first time. When he reached the temple, his students were already awake, preparing for morning meditation. They greeted him with bows, and he returned them, seeing each face as if for the first time. He realized he had been looking at them all these years through the lens of his expectations, his hopes and fears for them, his need for them to validate his teaching. But now, with that lens removed, he could see them as they truly were, complete, whole, exactly as they needed to be. He took his place at the front of the meditation hall and rang the bell, and the students settled into their cushions. He sat with them in silence, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he had nothing to teach them, nothing to give them, nothing to prove. He simply sat and breathed and let the morning light fill the hall, and that was enough. That evening, as the light faded from the sky, the teacher returned once more to the river. He had no names to release this time, no burdens to set down. He came simply to sit, to listen, to be present with the water and the gathering darkness. He found the same spot where he had knelt that morning, and he sat on the smooth stone, watching the river flow past. The water was darker now, reflecting the deep blue of the evening sky, and the sound of it seemed louder somehow in the quiet of dusk. He thought about the day, about the meditation with his students, about the simple meals they had shared, about the work they had done in the garden. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary, just the ordinary rhythm of temple life. But it had felt different to him, lighter and more spacious, as if there were room now for things to simply be what they were without him needing to shape them or control them or carry them. He thought about the names he had released, and he sent them a silent blessing wherever they were, whatever they were doing. He hoped they were well. He hoped they were finding their own way, learning their own lessons, releasing their own burdens. But he did not need to know. He could hold them in his heart without holding on to them, could love them without needing anything from them. The stars were beginning to appear, small points of light in the darkening sky, and he watched them emerge one by one. He had always loved this time of day, the transition from light to dark, the way the world grew quiet and still. It was a kind of letting go, this daily release of the sun, this surrender to darkness. And yet, the darkness was not empty or frightening. It was full of stars, full of possibility, full of rest. He sat there until the cold began to seep into his bones, and then he stood and walked slowly back to the temple. His sleeping mat was waiting for him, and he lay down on it with a deep sense of gratitude, not for anything in particular, but for everything, for the river, for the students, for the day, for the simple fact of being alive and aware in this moment. As the teacher closed his eyes and settled into sleep, he felt the river still flowing through his mind, carrying him gently forward into the darkness. He thought about how sleep itself was a kind of letting go, a daily practice of surrender, of releasing consciousness and control and trusting that he would wake again when the time came. He let his breath deepen and slow, matching the rhythm of the river, and he felt his body relax completely, sinking into the mat, into the earth beneath, into the great holding of the world. All the thoughts and worries and plans that had been circling in his mind began to drift away like leaves on water, and he did not try to hold them back or follow them. He simply let them go. And as he drifted deeper into sleep, he felt a profound peace settle over him, a peace that came not from having solved anything or achieved anything, but simply from having released everything, from having opened his hands and let the river carry what it would carry. The night held him gently, and the river flowed on in the darkness, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and all was exactly as it needed to be. And in that perfection, in that complete acceptance of what is, the teacher slept deeply and dreamlessly until the first light of morning called him back to the water's edge to begin again. And not far from here, where the river widens and the current slows, another story is waiting to unfold. There was a woman who had lost her husband many years before, and though the sharp edge of grief had dulled with time, she still carried him with her in everything she did. His favorite cup sat unused on the shelf. His clothes still hung in the closet. His books remained stacked beside the chair where he used to read. She had kept everything exactly as it was, as if by preserving the objects of his life, she could somehow keep him from being completely gone. She lived alone in a small house beside the river, and her days followed a quiet rhythm, tending her garden, preparing simple meals, sitting on the porch in the evenings and watching the water flow past. People from the village visited sometimes, bringing food or invitations, trying to draw her back into life, but she remained gently distant, polite but unreachable, as if she existed in a separate world from theirs. On this particular morning, she woke early and found that she could not fall back asleep. Something restless moved inside her, some unnamed disquiet, and finally she rose and dressed and stepped outside. The air was cool and fresh, and the river was running high from recent rains, its voice louder than usual, almost urgent. She walked down to the river bank, to a place where a large willow tree grew, its long branches trailing in the water. She had come here often with her husband, and they would sit beneath the tree and talk about small things, what to plant in the garden, what to cook for dinner, the antics of the village children. Simple conversations, nothing profound, but filled with the easy comfort of long companionship. She sat down now beneath the willow, in the exact spot where she used to sit, and she looked out at the river. It was moving faster than she had ever seen it, churning and swirling, carrying branches and leaves and debris from upstream. She watched a large piece of driftwood float past, smooth and gray, and she wondered how far it had traveled, what shores it had rested on before the current claimed it again. And as she watched the water, she began to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had allowed herself before, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from some place she had kept locked away for years. She cried for her husband, for the years they should have had together, for the conversations they would never have, for the simple joy of his presence that she would never feel again. The woman cried for a long time, letting the grief pour out of her unchecked, and when the tears finally subsided, she felt exhausted but also strangely lighter, as if something had been released that had needed releasing for a very long time. She sat there, breathing hard, and she looked up at the willow tree above her, at the way its branches moved in the wind, graceful and yielding. The tree did not hold onto its leaves when autumn came. It let them fall, let them drift to the ground or into the water, let them go without struggle or resistance. And in the spring, new leaves would come, fresh and green, and the tree would be beautiful again. Not the same beauty, but a new beauty, equally whole. She thought about her house, about all the things she had kept, about how she had tried to preserve everything exactly as it was. She had thought she was honoring her husband's memory, but now she wondered if she had been doing something else, trying to stop time, trying to prevent the natural flow of life and death and change. The river flowed past, indifferent to her thoughts, and she watched it with new eyes. The river did not try to hold on to the water that passed through it. It let each moment flow into the next, let each drop join the great movement toward the sea, and yet the river remained, constant in its changing, always itself, even as it was never the same. She stood slowly and walked back to the house. She went directly to the closet and opened it, looking at the row of her husband's clothes, his work shirts, his good jacket, his worn sweater. She reached out and touched the sleeve of the sweater, remembering how it had looked on him, how it had smelled of him, wool and soap and the faint scent of tobacco. And then, gently but firmly, she took it from the hanger. She folded it carefully and set it aside, and then she reached for the next item and the next, until all of his clothes were piled on the bed. She stood looking at them, and she felt her heart ache, but she also felt a strange sense of rightness, as if this was something she should have done long ago. She carried the clothes outside and placed them in a basket. She would take them to the village, she decided, and give them to people who needed them. Her husband would have liked that, she thought. He had been a practical man, a kind man, and he would not have wanted his things to sit unused when they could be warming someone else. Over the next few days, the woman went through the house, room by room, gently releasing the things that no longer served, the things she had been holding on to out of fear or grief or habit. She kept some items, a few photographs, his favorite book, a small carved wooden bird he had made for her, but she let go of the rest, giving them away or setting them aside to be passed on. Each release was difficult. Each object carried memories, and letting it go felt like losing him all over again. But she also felt something else, something unexpected. With each thing she released, she felt a little more space open up inside her, a little more room to breathe, a little more capacity to be present with what was actually here rather than what was gone. She thought about the river, about how it taught this lesson every moment of every day. The river received everything that fell into it, rain and snow, leaves and branches, even the tears of grieving widows, and it carried them all downstream, transforming them, releasing them, letting them become part of something larger. She began to spend more time by the river, sitting beneath the willow tree, watching the water flow. She noticed things she had never noticed before, the way the light changed throughout the day, the patterns the current made around the rocks, the birds that came to drink at the water's edge. She began to feel connected again, not to the past, but to the present, to this moment, to this day, to this life that was still hers to live. One afternoon, she brought her husband's favorite cup down to the river. It was a simple clay cup, rough and handmade, and he had used it every morning for his tea. She had kept it on the shelf, untouched, as if using it or giving it away would be a betrayal. But now she sat by the river and held the cup in her hands, and she understood that keeping it on the shelf, frozen in time, was not honoring him. What would honor him would be to use it, to let it serve its purpose, to allow it to be part of the ongoing flow of life. She filled the cup with river water and held it up to the light. The water caught the sun and glowed, and she thought about how her husband had loved the river, how he had spent hours fishing here, how he had taught her to see the beauty in simple things. "Thank you," she whispered to the cup, to the memory, to him. "Thank you for the years we had. Thank you for teaching me to notice beauty. Thank you for loving me." And then she poured the water back into the river, watching it merge with the current, becoming indistinguishable from the whole. She set the cup down beside her and decided she would use it tomorrow morning for her own tea, and every morning after that, and in the using, she would remember him not with grief, but with gratitude. As the days turned to weeks, the woman felt herself changing. The house, which had been a museum, became a home again. She rearranged the furniture, opened windows that had been closed for years, brought in fresh flowers from the garden. She began cooking new recipes instead of only the ones he had liked. She began reading different books, taking different walks, exploring different parts of the riverbank. She did not forget him. The memories remained, but they were gentler now, less painful, more like old friends she could visit when she chose rather than ghosts that haunted her constantly. She could think of him and smile, could remember the good times without being crushed by the weight of what was lost. She also began to reconnect with the villagers. She accepted invitations to share meals, to help with community projects, to sit with other women and talk about ordinary things. She was surprised to find that she had things to offer, that her years of solitude had taught her a kind of quiet wisdom, a capacity to listen deeply, to hold space for others' pain without trying to fix it. One evening, a younger woman from the village came to visit, someone who had recently lost her mother. She sat on the porch with the widow, and she cried, and the widow held her hand and said nothing. Just let her cry, let her grief flow like the river, knowing it needed to move, needed to be released. "Does it ever stop hurting?" the young woman asked finally. The widow looked out at the river, at the way the evening light turned the water to gold. "It changes," she said. "The sharp pain softens, but the love remains, and I've learned that love doesn't require us to hold on so tightly. We can love and let go at the same time. In fact, maybe that's what real love is, the willingness to let go, to allow things to change, to trust that what was beautiful remains beautiful even when it's gone." The young woman nodded, wiping her eyes, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the river flow, watching the light fade, watching the day release itself into night. That night, after the young woman had gone home, the widow prepared for bed in her quiet house. She moved through her evening ritual, washing her face, braiding her hair, laying out her clothes for tomorrow. She made herself a cup of tea in her husband's cup, and she sat by the window and drank it slowly, looking out at the river in the darkness. She thought about the journey she had taken, from the frozen grief that had held her captive for so long to this new place of gentle acceptance, of openness to life. It had not been easy. There had been many days when the letting go felt impossible, when the grief threatened to pull her back into that locked room of memory and refusal. But the river had taught her patience. It had shown her that letting go was not a single act, but a practice, something to be done again and again, moment by moment, breath by breath. Each morning she woke and made the choice to open her hands, to release what needed releasing, to allow the current of life to carry her forward. She finished her tea and washed the cup, setting it on the counter to dry, ready for tomorrow's use. Then she went to her sleeping mat and lay down, pulling the blanket over herself. Through the window, she could hear the river, its voice constant and soothing, and she let the sound fill her mind, washing away the thoughts and worries of the day. As the widow settled into sleep, she felt a deep gratitude for the river, for the lessons it had taught her, for the way it had held her grief and carried it downstream, transforming it into something else, something lighter. She thought about her husband, and she sent him a silent blessing, wherever he was, and she felt no pain in the thought, only love, pure and simple. She let her breathing slow and deepen, matching the rhythm of the water, and she felt herself being carried gently into sleep, like a leaf floating on the surface of the river, surrendering to the current, trusting the flow. And as she drifted away, she felt a profound peace, knowing that she had finally learned the river's greatest teaching, that letting go is not losing but freeing, not ending but beginning again. And the night held her gently, and the river flowed on in the darkness, carrying everything forward, releasing everything in turn, and all was exactly as it needed to be. And where the river bends and the water deepens, one more story rises to meet the night. There was a fisherman who had lived his entire life by the river. He had learned to fish from his father, and his father from his grandfather, and the knowledge had been passed down through generations like the river itself, constant and flowing. The fisherman knew every rock and pool, every current and eddy, every place where the fish liked to gather depending on the season and the weather. He had been a good fisherman, perhaps the best in the village, and his catch had fed his family and many others. But now he was old, and his hands were no longer steady, and his eyes could not see the subtle movements in the water that had once told him where the fish were hiding. He still went to the river every day, still cast his line, but more often than not, he came home with nothing. This troubled him deeply. His identity, his sense of worth, had been built on his skill as a fisherman, and now that skill was leaving him, slipping away like water through his fingers. He felt useless, diminished, as if he were disappearing along with his ability. On this particular day, he had been sitting by the river for hours without a single bite, and frustration rose in him like a tide. He had always been patient, had understood that fishing required stillness and acceptance, but now his patience felt like weakness, and his stillness felt like defeat. He was about to pack up his things and go home when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw a young boy approaching, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with a homemade fishing pole in one hand and a look of eager determination on his face. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said shyly. "My father said you're the best fisherman in the village. Could you teach me how to fish?" The fisherman felt something twist in his chest. Here was this child, seeking knowledge from him, believing in a skill that the fisherman himself no longer trusted. He wanted to say no, to send the boy away, to protect him from the disappointment of learning from someone who could no longer deliver. But something in the boy's eyes stopped him. A hopefulness, an innocence, a belief that this old man by the river still had something valuable to offer. And so, against his better judgment, the fisherman nodded. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the space beside him. The boy sat eagerly, clutching his crude fishing pole, and the fisherman looked at him and felt a strange mixture of emotions, tenderness, regret, a faint stirring of something that might have been hope. He had not taught anyone to fish in many years, had not thought there was anything left to teach. "First," the fisherman said slowly, "you must understand the river. It is not your enemy, and it is not your servant. It is its own thing, with its own rhythms and its own purposes. The fish belong to the river, not to you. If you catch one, it is because the river has offered it, not because you have taken it." The boy nodded seriously, and the fisherman continued, "Watch the water. See how it moves differently in different places. Fast here, slow there, swirling around that rock, smooth in that pool. The fish hide where the water gives them shelter and brings them food. Your job is to understand where those places are." They sat together, and the fisherman pointed out the patterns in the water, the places where the current created eddies, the spots where insects tended to gather on the surface. He showed the boy how to read the light on the water, how to notice the slight dimples that indicated fish rising to feed. As he taught, the fisherman felt something unexpected happening. The words were coming easily, naturally, as if they had been waiting inside him all along. He had thought his knowledge was tied to his physical ability, that without the skill of catching fish, the knowledge itself was worthless. But now he saw that this was not true. The knowledge was separate, deeper, something that could be given even if the doing could no longer be done. "Now," the fisherman said, "let me see your pole." The boy handed it over, and the fisherman examined it. It was rough, made from a stick and some string and a bent pin for a hook, but it was sound enough. He helped the boy tie on a small piece of bread for bait, and then he showed him how to cast, how to hold the line, how to wait. "The most important part," the fisherman said, "is patience. The river moves in its own time, and the fish come when they are ready. You cannot force it. You can only be present, be ready, and accept what comes or does not come." They sat together for a long time, the old fisherman and the young boy, their lines in the water, the sun warm on their backs. The fisherman found himself relaxing in a way he had not relaxed in months. He was not trying to catch anything, not trying to prove anything. He was simply being here, sharing what he knew, and somehow that was enough. The boy was quiet, watching his line intently, and the fisherman smiled at his seriousness. He remembered being that age, remembered the intensity with which he had pursued every fish, the triumph he had felt with every catch, the crushing disappointment with every empty hook. "I haven't caught anything yet," the boy said after a while, his voice small. "Neither have I," the fisherman said. "And that's all right. Fishing isn't just about catching fish. It's about being here, by the river, paying attention. It's about learning to wait, learning to accept, learning to let go of needing things to be a certain way." The boy looked at him, confused. "But don't you want to catch fish?" "Of course," the fisherman said. "But I've learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that wanting something and needing it are different things. I can want to catch fish, and I can try my best, but if I need to catch fish to feel worthwhile, then I'm in trouble. Because the river doesn't care what I need, the river just is." As if in response to his words, the boy's line suddenly jerked, and the boy gasped and jumped to his feet. The fisherman laughed and helped him hold the pole steady, guiding his hands, teaching him how to feel the fish on the line, how to let it run when it needed to run, how to reel it in when it tired. Together, they brought the fish to the bank, a small silver fish that flipped and struggled in the boy's hands. The fisherman showed him how to remove the hook carefully, how to hold the fish gently, and then he said something that surprised even himself. "Now let it go." The boy stared at him. "What? Let it go?" the fisherman repeated. "Put it back in the river." "But I caught it," the boy protested. "I want to keep it to show my father." The fisherman smiled. "You did catch it, and you can tell your father all about it. But this fish is small, still young. If you let it go, it will grow, and maybe someday you'll catch it again, or maybe it will feed another fisherman's family. Either way, letting it go is a gift to the river, a way of saying thank you for the lesson you learned today." The boy hesitated, clearly torn, but then he nodded and knelt at the water's edge. He held the fish just below the surface, and after a moment, it wriggled free and darted away into the deeper water, a quick silver flash, and then it was gone. The boy sat back on his heels and looked up at the fisherman. "I feel sad," he said, "but also, I don't know, good somehow." "Yes," the fisherman said quietly, "that's what letting go feels like. Sad and good at the same time. You had something, and then you released it, and now you have the memory and the lesson, which are worth more than the thing itself." They packed up their things as the sun began to set, and the boy thanked the fisherman profusely, promising to come back and fish with him again. The fisherman watched him run off down the path toward the village, and he felt something warm and unexpected blooming in his chest. He looked out at the river, at the water flowing endlessly past, and he understood something he had not understood before. His worth was not in his ability to catch fish. His worth was in what he had learned from the river, and in his ability to pass that learning on, to offer it to others who were still at the beginning of their own journeys. He had thought that losing his skill meant losing everything, but now he saw that he had been holding on too tightly to one way of being, one identity. And in letting go of that, and accepting that he was no longer the fisherman he used to be, he had made room for something new, not a replacement, but a deepening, a widening. He could still be of use, still offer something valuable, not through his hands, but through his heart, not through doing, but through sharing, not through catching, but through teaching what he had learned about waiting, about patience, about the relationship between effort and acceptance, about the art of letting go. That evening, the fisherman walked slowly home, his empty basket light on his back, his heart lighter still. He thought about the boy and the fish, about the lesson they had both learned, the boy in catching and releasing, the fisherman in teaching and letting go of his need to be who he used to be. At home, he prepared a simple meal and ate it slowly, savoring the tastes, the textures. He washed his bowl and set it aside, and then he sat by his small window and looked out at the darkening sky. The river was visible from here, a silver ribbon in the twilight, and he could hear its voice, constant and familiar, like an old friend. He thought about all the years he had spent by that river, all the fish he had caught, all the mornings and evenings, all the seasons cycling through their endless rhythm. He thought about how the river had taught him everything, how to read the water, how to wait, how to accept what came and what didn't come. And now, in his old age. It was teaching him the final lesson, the one he had been resisting for so long. You are not what you do. You are not your skill or your strength or your achievement. You are something deeper, something that remains even when the doing stops, even when the ability fades. You are the awareness, the presence, the quiet witness who has been watching all along, and that cannot be lost because it was never dependent on anything external in the first place. He felt tears on his cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of letting go of a burden he had not known he was carrying. He sat there and cried quietly, and the river flowed on outside his window, and the night grew darker, and finally he rose and made his way to his sleeping mat. The fisherman lay down and pulled his blanket over himself, and he closed his eyes and listened to the river. Its voice was so familiar, so constant, and tonight it seemed to be speaking directly to him, whispering the lesson he had finally learned. Let go, let go, let go. Not a harsh command, but a gentle invitation. Let go of who you think you should be. Let go of your need to remain unchanged. Let go of your grip on the past. Let go and trust that what remains is enough, has always been enough, will always be enough. He felt his body relaxing completely, sinking into the mat, and he felt his mind growing quiet. All the thoughts and worries and regrets drifting away like leaves on water. He thought about the boy and the fish, and he smiled in the darkness, grateful for the unexpected gift of that encounter, grateful for the chance to give something away, to share what he had learned, to pass the knowledge forward like the river itself, always flowing, always offering, always letting go. And as he drifted into sleep, he felt the river carrying him gently, felt himself dissolving into the great current, and there was no fear in it, only peace, only acceptance, only the deep and abiding knowledge that this was how it had always been, how it would always be, everything flowing, everything changing, everything held in the river's endless embrace. And the night held him gently, and the river flowed on, carrying everything forward, releasing everything in turn. And in that eternal letting go, all was well, all was complete, all was exactly as it needed to be. There was a potter who lived in a small workshop by the river, and for 30 years she had been making vessels, bowls, and cups and vases, each one shaped by her hands on the wheel, each one fired in her kiln, each one unique. Her work was known throughout the region, and people came from distant villages to buy her pieces, praising the elegance of her forms, the subtlety of her glazes, the way each vessel seemed to have its own quiet personality. But the potter had a secret that no one knew. In a locked cabinet in the back of her workshop, she kept every piece that had ever broken during the firing, every vessel that had cracked or warped or shattered in the kiln. There were hundreds of them, carefully stored, wrapped in cloth, preserved like relics. She could not bring herself to throw them away, these failures, these imperfect children of clay and fire. She told herself she kept them to learn from them, to study what had gone wrong, to improve her technique. But the truth, which she barely admitted even to herself, was that she could not let go. Each broken piece felt like a failure of her own, a flaw in her skill, and discarding them would be like admitting that she was not the master potter she wanted to be, that despite 30 years of work, she still made mistakes. On this particular morning, the potter woke to find that her workshop had flooded during the night. The river, swollen with spring rains, had risen higher than it had in decades, and water had seeped under the door and spread across the floor, reaching nearly to her wheel. She stood in the doorway, looking at the water, and her first thought was of the cabinet. She waded through the shallow water to the back of the workshop and opened the cabinet with trembling hands. Water had gotten in, and the cloth wrappings were soaked. She pulled out the first bundle and unwrapped it, and the pieces inside fragments of a bowl that had cracked years ago crumbled in her hands. The clay softened by the water, dissolving into mud. She stood there, holding the dissolving clay, and something broke open inside her. All these years, all this careful preservation, and in one night the river had undone it all. The broken pieces were returning to mud, to earth, to the river itself, and she could not stop it. She sank down onto the wet floor, still holding the crumbling fragments, and she began to cry. Not just for the broken vessels, but for all the years she had spent holding on, for all the energy she had poured into preserving what should have been released long ago, for the weight of all that accumulated failure that she had carried in secret. The potter sat there for a long time, letting the tears come, letting the clay dissolve in her hands, and as she sat, she began to notice something. The water on the floor was moving, flowing slowly toward the door, finding its way back to the river. It did not ask permission. It did not apologize for disrupting her workshop. It simply flowed, following its nature, doing what water does. She looked at the muddy clay in her hands, and she understood suddenly that this was not a disaster. This was the river, teaching her what she had been too afraid to learn on her own. Clay comes from the earth, and to the earth it returns. Every vessel, broken or whole, is temporary, a brief shaping of what was always meant to flow and change and transform. She stood slowly and carried the dissolved clay to the door, and she poured it into the flowing water, watching it mix and swirl and disappear. Then she went back to the cabinet and pulled out another bundle and another, unwrapping each one, letting the water soften the clay, carrying it all to the door and releasing it to the river. With each release, she felt lighter. The weight she had been carrying for 30 years, the secret shame of all these failures, was flowing away, and in its place came a strange kind of freedom. She was not a perfect potter. She had never been a perfect potter. She had made mistakes, and she would make more, and that was not something to hide or preserve or cling to. It was simply part of the process, part of the learning, part of being human. By the time she had emptied the entire cabinet, the sun was high in the sky, and the floodwater was beginning to recede. The workshop floor was covered in muddy tracks and wet clay, and the cabinet stood empty, its shelves bare for the first time in 30 years. She sat down on her stool by the wheel, exhausted but oddly peaceful, and she looked around the workshop. It would need cleaning, drying, reorganizing. But it felt different already, more spacious, as if the air itself had changed. The weight was gone, the secret was gone, and what remained was just her, and her wheel, and the work itself, freed from the burden of needing to be perfect. Over the following days, as the workshop dried out and the potter cleaned and reorganized, she found herself working differently. When she sat at the wheel and began to shape a new vessel, she was more relaxed, more playful. She took risks she would not have taken before, tried forms that were unconventional, experimented with glazes she had always been too cautious to use. And yes, some of these experiments failed. A bowl collapsed on the wheel, a vase cracked in the kiln, a glaze ran in an unexpected way. But when these things happened, instead of feeling the familiar twist of shame and disappointment, she simply looked at the broken piece, learned what she could from it, and then carried it outside to a growing pile behind the workshop. She had decided that once the pile was large enough, She would break the pieces down into clay again and return them to the earth, or perhaps use them to fill in the low spots in the path to her workshop. The failures would become useful in a different way, transformed by her willingness to let them go. One afternoon, a customer came to the workshop, a wealthy merchant who had commissioned a large vase for his home. The potter had been working on it for weeks, and it was nearly finished. A beautiful piece with a complex glaze that shifted from deep blue to soft green. She was proud of it, perhaps the finest thing she had made in years. But when she opened the kiln after the final firing, she found that a crack had appeared during the cooling, a thin line running from the rim halfway down the side. The vase was still beautiful, still functional, but it was flawed, imperfect, and the merchant had paid for perfection. The old potter would have hidden this piece, would have added it to the cabinet of failures, would have felt crushed by the disappointment. But this potter, this new version of herself who had learned to let go, simply picked up the vase and looked at the crack with clear eyes. It was a flaw, yes, but it was also interesting. The crack followed the line where two colors of glaze met, and it had created a kind of accent, a deliberate-looking detail that drew the eye. She traced it with her finger and felt the slight roughness. And she thought about the Japanese philosophy of wabi-sabi, the appreciation of imperfection, the beauty of things that are worn or weathered or flawed. When the merchant arrived, she showed him the vase honestly, pointing out the crack, offering to make another piece. But the merchant surprised her. He looked at the crack for a long moment, and then he smiled. "I like it," he said. "It makes the piece more interesting, more real. It shows that it was made by human hands, not by a machine. I'll take it as it is." The potter was stunned. She wrapped the vase carefully and watched the merchant carry it away, and she felt something shift in her understanding. What she had thought was a failure, what she had been ready to discard or hide, had been received with appreciation, with recognition that imperfection itself could be valuable, could be beautiful. She thought about all the pieces in the cabinet, all those years of hiding her mistakes, and she wondered how many of them might have been received differently if she had been brave enough to show them, to offer them as they were rather than measuring them against some impossible standard of perfection. She sat at her wheel that evening and began to shape a new bowl, and as she worked, she deliberately created a small irregularity in the rim, a place where her finger had pressed slightly too hard. The old potter would have smoothed it out, would have insisted on perfect symmetry. But this potter let it remain, let it be part of the character of the piece, let it tell the truth about the process of making. As the bowl took shape under her hands, she thought about the river, about how it had forced her to let go, about how the flooding had been not a disaster but a gift. The river had dissolved her failures and carried them away, and in doing so, it had shown her that holding on to mistakes only gives them weight, only makes them solid and permanent. Releasing them allows them to transform, to return to the flow, to become something else. She finished the bowl and set it aside to dry, and she looked at the small irregularity in the rim with affection. It was imperfect, yes, but it was also honest and real, and alive in a way that perfect symmetry could never be. That night, she made herself a simple dinner and ate it from one of her own bowls, a piece she had made years ago that had a slightly uneven base. She had always been mildly embarrassed by this bowl, but now she appreciated it, the way it sat at a gentle angle on the table, the way it required a small adjustment to keep it steady. It was a bowl that asked for attention, for care, and in that asking, it created a moment of mindfulness, a pause, a small opportunity to be present. As the days turned to weeks, the potter found herself developing a new relationship with her work. She still strived for excellence, still paid careful attention to her technique, still worked to improve. But she no longer needed her pieces to be perfect. She could appreciate them as they were, with their quirks and irregularities and occasional flaws, and she could offer them to the world with openness rather than anxiety. One evening, she decided to create something entirely new, something she had never attempted before. She gathered the broken pieces from behind the workshop, the failures she had been planning to return to the earth, and she began to experiment with them. She crushed some into powder and mixed them into new clay. She used others as texture, pressing fragments into the surface of new vessels to create patterns and designs. The pieces she created this way were strange and unexpected, rough in some places, smooth in others, marked by the scars of previous failures, but transformed into something new. She fired them carefully, not knowing what would emerge, and when she opened the kiln, she found vessels unlike anything she had made before, powerful, raw, honest pieces that spoke of transformation and acceptance and the beauty of letting go. She displayed these pieces at the front of her workshop, and people stopped to look at them with curiosity. Some were puzzled, some were moved, and some saw immediately what she was doing, what she was saying through the clay. One woman, an elderly artist from a neighboring village, stood in front of the pieces for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft with recognition. "These are about forgiveness, aren't they?" she said. "Forgiving yourself for not being perfect. Forgiving the clay for breaking. Forgiving the fire for doing what fire does." The potter nodded, feeling tears rise in her eyes. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what they're about." The woman bought one of the pieces, a bowl made from crushed fragments mixed with new clay, and as the potter wrapped it, she felt a deep sense of completion, as if a circle had been closed, as if the failures of 30 years had finally found their purpose. That night, the potter walked down to the river and sat on the bank, in the place where the water had risen and flooded her workshop. The river was calm now, flowing within its usual boundaries, and the evening light turned the water to silver and gold. She thought about everything the river had taught her, about the flood that had forced her to release what she had been holding, about the way water transforms everything it touches, softening and dissolving and carrying things forward. She thought about how the river never holds on, never tries to keep the water that flows through it, and yet it is always full, always itself, precisely because of that endless letting go. She understood now that she had been trying to control something that could not be controlled. Clay has its own nature, and fire has its own nature, and the interaction between them is unpredictable, mysterious, alive. She could shape and influence, but she could not dictate, and trying to preserve every failure, every mistake, had been a way of trying to control the uncontrollable, to make permanent what was always meant to be temporary. Letting go did not mean not caring. It meant caring deeply, but holding lightly, giving her best effort, and then releasing the outcome, trusting that whatever emerged had its own perfection, even if it was not the perfection she had imagined. She sat there until the stars came out, watching the river flow, listening to its constant voice. And when she finally rose to return home, she felt a profound gratitude for the flood, for the loss, for the forced release that had freed her from a burden she had carried for too long. At home, she prepared for bed in her quiet workshop, now clean and reorganized, the empty cabinet standing open, its shelves bare and ready for something new. She lay down on her sleeping mat and pulled the blanket over herself, and she closed her eyes and listened to the distant sound of the river. As the potter settled into sleep, she thought about tomorrow, about the work she would do, about the clay she would shape and the fire she would tend. She thought about the mistakes she would inevitably make, and instead of fearing them, she welcomed them, understanding that they were part of the process, part of the learning, part of being alive and present, and willing to risk failure for the sake of creation. She felt her breathing slow and deepen, matching the rhythm of the river, and she felt her body relax completely, releasing the day, releasing the effort, releasing the need to be anything other than what she was. And as she drifted into sleep, she felt the river flowing through her dreams, carrying her gently forward, teaching her again and again the lesson she would spend the rest of her life learning. Let go, let go, let go. Not as a loss, but as a liberation. Not as an ending, but as a transformation. Not as failure, but as faith. Faith that the river knows where it's going, that the current will carry what needs carrying, and that in the great flow of things, nothing is ever truly lost, only changed, only released into the next moment, the next form, the next possibility. And the night held her gently, and the river flowed on, and all was well, all was complete, all was exactly as it needed to be. And in a village downstream, where the river widens and slows, another soul is learning to open its hands. There was a teacher who had dedicated her life to her students. She had taught in the same small school for 25 years, watching children grow from shy 6-year-olds into confident young adults, ready to leave the village and make their way in the world. She had poured everything into her teaching, her time, her energy, her heart, and she had loved it, had found deep meaning in the work of shaping young minds and opening young hearts to learning. But now, her health was failing. A sickness had come upon her gradually, stealing her strength, making even simple tasks exhausting. The headmaster had suggested gently that it might be time to retire, to rest, to let a younger teacher take over her classroom. And though she knew he was right, though she could feel her body giving her the same message, she could not bring herself to let go. The classroom was her life. Her students were her purpose. Without them, who would she be? What would fill her days? The thought of retiring, of stepping away from the work that had defined her for so long, felt like a kind of death, a loss so profound that she could not face it. On this particular morning, she arrived at school early, as she always did, and she made her way slowly to her classroom. The building was empty, quiet, and her footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. She opened the door to her room and stood there, looking at the rows of small desks, the chalkboard with yesterday's lesson still written on it, the drawings and papers pinned to the walls. This room had been her domain, her sanctuary, her place of purpose. She walked slowly between the desks, trailing her hand along the wooden surfaces, and she thought about all the students who had sat here over the years, all the lessons she had taught, all the small moments of breakthrough and understanding and growth that she had witnessed. She sat down at her desk at the front of the room and looked out at the empty chairs, and she felt tears rise in her eyes. How could she leave this? How could she walk away from something that had meant so much, that had given her life shape and meaning? But even as she asked the question, she felt her body's answer. She was so tired. The exhaustion went bone deep, and she knew that she could not continue much longer, that pushing herself would only make things worse. She needed to rest. She needed to let go. The teacher sat at her desk for a long time, struggling with the decision she knew she had to make. And then, quietly, she heard footsteps in the hallway, and a young woman appeared in the doorway, the new teacher who had been hired to assist her. a bright and enthusiastic recent graduate who had been observing her classes and learning her methods. "Oh," the young woman said, surprised to find her there so early. "Good morning. I didn't expect anyone to be here yet." The teacher smiled tiredly. "I like to come early," she said, "to sit with the quiet before the children arrive." The young woman nodded and came into the room, setting down her bag. "I do that too," she said. "I find it helps me prepare, to spend a few moments in stillness before the energy of the day begins." They sat together in comfortable silence, and the teacher watched the young woman, saw the eagerness in her eyes, the readiness, the passion for teaching that was so familiar because she herself had felt it once, at the beginning of her own career. "You're going to be a wonderful teacher," the teacher said quietly. The young woman looked at her, startled. "Thank you," she said. "That means so much, coming from you. I've learned so much just from watching you with the children, the way you listen to them, the way you make each one feel seen." The teacher felt something shift inside her, a small easing of the tightness in her chest. She had been so focused on what she was losing, on what she would have to give up, that she had not considered what she might be giving to someone else. This young woman was ready. She was capable, and she would carry the work forward, would bring her own gifts and her own insights, would teach in her own way. "I've been thinking," the teacher said slowly, "that it might be time for me to step back, to let you take over the classroom." The young woman's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I know you love teaching. I don't want you to feel pushed out." "I do love it," the teacher said. "And that's precisely why I need to let go while I still can, while I can make the choice consciously rather than having it taken from me. I need to trust that the work will continue, that the children will be cared for, that the teaching I've done for 25 years has meaning even after I'm no longer in the classroom." Over the following weeks, the teacher began the process of letting go. She worked with the young woman to transfer her lesson plans, to share her insights about individual students, to pass on the small rituals and routines that had made her classroom a place of warmth and learning. And as she did this, she found that the fear and resistance began to ease. Letting go did not mean that what she had done was worthless. It meant that it was complete, that it had served its purpose, and that now it was time for something new. The young teacher would teach differently, would make different choices, would create her own rituals and routines. And that was not a loss, but a continuation, a natural evolution, the way the river flows from one form into another. On her last day, the teacher stood in front of her classroom and looked at the children, and she felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. She had taught many of their parents and some of their grandparents, and the connections ran deep, woven into the fabric of the village like threads in a tapestry. "Thank you," she said simply, "for letting me be your teacher, for sharing your growth with me, for teaching me as much as I taught you." The children presented her with gifts, drawings, poems, a small carved wooden bird that one of the older students had made. She accepted them with tears in her eyes, and then she introduced the young teacher, told them how fortunate they were to have her, how much they would learn and grow under her guidance. And then, with a final bow to the classroom, to the children, to the work itself, she walked out the door and did not look back. In the months that followed, the teacher learned to live differently. At first, the days felt empty, directionless, and she struggled with the loss of routine, the absence of purpose. But gradually, she began to discover new rhythms, new ways of being. She spent time by the river, watching the water flow, learning its moods and its lessons. She visited old friends she had neglected during her busy teaching years. She read books she had been meaning to read for decades. She sat in her garden and watched the plants grow, noticing details she had never had time to notice before. The way the light fell through the leaves, the patterns of the bees visiting flowers, the slow miracle of seed becoming plant, becoming flower, becoming seed again. And sometimes she walked past the school and heard the children's voices through the open windows, heard the young teacher leading a lesson, and she felt a complex mixture of emotions, nostalgia, yes, and a small ache of loss, but also satisfaction and pride and a deep peace, knowing that the work was continuing, that she had been part of something larger than herself, something that would outlast her. One afternoon, she was sitting by the river when the young teacher found her and sat down beside her. "I wanted to thank you," the young teacher said, "for trusting me with your classroom, for sharing everything you knew, for letting go gracefully." The teacher smiled. "It wasn't always graceful," she admitted. "There were days when I wanted to go back, when I questioned whether I had made the right decision. But the river helped me understand. Do you see how it flows? It doesn't hold onto the water. It lets it pass through, and because it lets go, it remains full, remains itself." They sat together in silence, watching the water, and the teacher felt a deep contentment. She had let go, and she had survived. More than survived, she had discovered that there was life beyond the classroom, meaning beyond the work that had defined her for so long. She was still herself, still valuable, still learning and growing, just in different ways. That evening, as the sun set and the sky filled with color, the teacher walked slowly home. She prepared a simple meal and ate it by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. And then she went to her sleeping mat and lay down, pulling the blanket over herself. She thought about her students, scattered now across the village and beyond, living their lives, carrying with them whatever she had been able to give them. She thought about the young teacher, bringing her own gifts to the classroom, creating her own legacy. She thought about the river, endlessly flowing, endlessly letting go, endlessly teaching the lesson she was still learning. And as she settled into sleep, she felt a profound gratitude for everything, for the years of teaching, for the students who had filled her life with purpose, for the young teacher who had allowed her to let go, for the river that had shown her how. She felt grateful for the sickness that had forced her to stop, to rest, to discover that she was more than her work, that her value did not depend on what she did but on who she was, on the awareness and presence and love that remained constant even as everything else changed. Her breathing slowed and deepened, and she felt herself being carried gently into sleep, like a leaf on the surface of the river, surrendering to the current, trusting the flow. And as she drifted away, she whispered a final blessing, not just for her students or for the young teacher, but for herself, for the courage it had taken to let go, for the faith it had required to trust that everything would be all right. And the night held her gently, and the river flowed on in the darkness, carrying everything forward, releasing everything in turn, teaching its eternal lesson to all who would listen. Let go, let go. Let go, not as loss, but as freedom, not as ending, but as transformation, not as death, but as the endless cycle of release and renewal, of opening and receiving, of giving and being given to, of flowing and being flowed through. And all was well, all was complete, all was exactly as it needed to be. And now, as these stories settle like mist on the river's surface, let yourself settle too. The water has carried so much tonight, broken vessels and old names, grief and expectations, roles we thought defined us. All of it flowing downstream, dissolving into the current, returning to the source. And what remains? Only this moment, only your breath, only the quiet peace of having released what needed releasing. There is nothing left to hold on to tonight, no burden to carry across the threshold of sleep. The river has taken it all, gently, patiently, the way rivers do, and you are lighter now, freer, more spacious inside. Let your breathing deepen. Let your body sink into whatever holds you. Let the sound of the river fill your mind, that constant, eternal flowing that asks nothing of you, that carries everything without effort, that teaches by simply being what it is. You don't need to be anything else tonight. You don't need to hold anything together. You can open your hands. You can trust the current. You can let the river carry you softly into sleep, knowing that it knows the way, knowing that in the morning you will wake renewed, like the water itself, always ancient and always new. Rest now. Release now. Let go now. The river flows on, and you are held within its endless embrace, safe and free and finally able to rest. Sleep well.